Nobody can tell you there's only one.
In the summer of 1974, 7-year-old Owen Elliot sat in an airplane seat while her mother leaned over her one last time. Cass Elliot fastened the little girl's seatbelt, kissed her, and told her not to worry. They would be together again soon. Cass was leaving for London, where she was preparing for an important run of performances at the Palladium, and Owen was flying to Baltimore to spend the summer with her grandmother. Before stepping off the plane, Cass gave her daughter one final instruction. "Look toward the airport windows," she told her. "I'll be standing there, and I'll wave to you." Owen waited. Then she looked through the glass, and there was her mother, just as promised, waving goodbye. Neither of them could have known what that ordinary moment would become. Owen would never see her mother alive again. To millions of Americans, Cass Elliot was the unforgettable voice of the mamas and the papas, the woman whose warm, soaring harmonies helped turn songs like California Dreamin' and Monday, Monday into part of the soundtrack of the 1960s. Television audiences knew her smile. Record buyers knew her voice almost instantly. By the early 1970s, she had stepped beyond the group and was trying to establish something she had wanted for years, an identity of her own, not simply Mama Cass, but Cass Elliot. Yet behind that familiar public image was a life far more complicated than most listeners understood. Long before America embraced her voice, she had struggled simply to be accepted into the group that would eventually make her famous. Her appearance had been questioned. Her weight became the subject of jokes, comments, and even song lyrics. And while audiences were falling in love with her, she was quietly in love with a man who did not love her in the same way. Later, when she became a mother, she guarded one secret with remarkable determination: the identity of her daughter's father. Even some of the people closest to her did not know the answer. Shortly before that final journey to London, Michelle Phillips asked Cass to finally tell her who Owen's father was. Cass reportedly promised she would tell her when she returned. She never did. Then came July 1974. Cass was only 32 when she was found lifeless in a London bedroom. Almost immediately, a strange and humiliating story began spreading about how she had died. It would follow her name for decades, repeated so often that generations came to accept it as fact. But Owen, the little girl who had watched her mother wave through that airport window, would eventually say that story was not true. And years after Cass was gone, Owen would discover something else. A letter her mother had written to her from London, but never mailed. It contained no dramatic farewell and no warning of what was about to happen. It was simply a letter from a mother to her 7-year-old daughter. To understand why that unfinished letter matters so much, and why the truth about Cass Elliot's final days became buried beneath one of rock and roll's most persistent myths, we have to go back to the beginning. To a young girl from Baltimore who had an extraordinary voice, an unmistakable presence, and a long road ahead before anyone was willing to believe she belonged. Long before millions of Americans knew the name Cass Elliot, she was Ellen Naomi Cohen, a girl growing up in Baltimore who seemed to understand early that being noticed and being accepted were not always the same thing. Born in September 1941 to a Russian Jewish immigrant family that struggled financially during her childhood, she possessed the kind of personality people remembered. She was outgoing, funny, and drawn to an audience. But there was already something that made her experience different from many of the young women she would later encounter in show business. Cass struggled with her weight from an early age, and with the judgments that came with it. In high school, however, she discovered a place where those judgments could briefly become less important. She found theater. Performing gave her somewhere to put the confidence and energy that everyday life did not always reward. And before long, Ellen Cohen began imagining a life beyond Baltimore. She adopted the name Cass Elliot, reportedly taking Cass from actress Peggy Cass and Elliot, in memory of a friend who had died. The new name seemed to accompany a new determination. She left high school and headed for New York, hoping Broadway might be waiting for her. It wasn't. One early disappointment came when she lost her role to another young performer who had not yet become a household name, Barbara Streisand. Cass eventually turned away from acting and toward the talent that would define the rest of her life, her voice. Between 1962 and 1964, she sang with groups including the Big Three and later the Mugwumps. During her time with the Big Three, she performed at the Bitter End in Greenwich Village. And according to her daughter Owen, that was where Denny Doherty first heard her. He later remembered hearing a woman singing through the stone walls of the club and going to investigate. What he found was Cass. The two quickly became friends, and Owen believed her mother developed something more than friendship for the handsome Canadian singer. Denny would become one of the most important people in Cass's story, though not in the way she may have hoped. In 1963, Cass married fellow musician James Hendricks, but according to accounts repeated in the first source, theirs was not a conventional romance. The marriage was described as an arrangement intended to help Hendricks avoid the draft. It lasted only a short time, and as the Mugwumps fell apart, the musicians began moving in different directions. Denny soon joined John and Michelle Phillips, the married couple who would become central to the next chapter of Cass's life. They were developing a new musical partnership, and Cass wanted to be part of it. Perhaps she recognized what their voices could become together. Perhaps Denny was part of the reason she remained so determined to stay close. Most likely, the two things could not easily be separated. When Denny, John, and Michelle eventually headed for the Virgin Islands, Cass was not formally part of their group. She had not been given a place beside them. So she made a decision that says something about the woman she already was. She followed them anyway. Michelle would later remember seeing a tiny figure far down the beach, growing larger as it approached, until she realized it was Cass. She had simply shown up. But arriving on the island did not mean she had arrived in the group. Before long, the woman whose voice would help define the Mamas and the Papas would find herself in an extraordinary position, watching the others perform while she waited tables below them, singing her harmonies from the floor. In the Virgin Islands, Cass Elliot was close enough to the music to hear every harmony, yet she was still not standing where she wanted to be. At Duffy's on St. Thomas, Denny Doherty, John Phillips, and Michelle Phillips had secured work entertaining the customers, while Cass found herself waiting tables. It was an unusual position for a woman with a voice as commanding as hers. According to her daughter Owen, Cass sometimes sang her harmony parts from the floor while moving among the tables, joining the voices coming from the stage without actually being on it. She wanted to be part of what they were creating, but wanting it did not immediately make her one of them. John had a particular idea of what the group should sound and look like, and Cass did not easily fit that picture. Accounts of those years have offered different explanations for his reluctance. One frequently repeated version was that her voice was too low for the arrangements. Other accounts, including those discussed by the people closest to the group, suggest her appearance and weight were also part of the hesitation. For Cass, who had already spent years living with comments about her size, it was another reminder that talent alone did not always decide who was allowed onto the stage. Then came one of the strangest stories in the history of the Mamas and the Papas. For years, a tale circulated that while Cass was in the Virgin Islands, a pipe fell from a construction site and struck her on the head. According to the story, the injury somehow expanded her vocal range, allowing her to reach the higher notes John wanted and finally making her suitable for the group. It was a colorful explanation, almost too perfect for rock and roll folklore. Later accounts questioned whether it happened that way at all, suggesting the story may have provided a more comfortable explanation for why Cass had not been welcome sooner. Whatever happened beneath that construction site, the important change was undeniable. Eventually, the three voices became four. Back in Los Angeles, another door opened. Cass knew Barry Maguire, whose Eve of Destruction had made him a major name, and he encouraged the singers to audition for producer Lou Adler at Dunhill Records. Even then, Owen recalled, Cass had not been formally invited into the group by John. The others persuaded her to attend the audition anyway. They sang the material they had been developing, including songs that would soon become inseparable from the era. Adler liked what he heard and told them to return the following day. When they came back, contracts were waiting. Michelle later remembered Cass producing a pen, eager to sign. After all the uncertainty, she finally had something tangible telling her that she belonged. Soon the group had a name, the Mamas and the Papas, and then came the moment that changed everything. California Dreamin' began playing on American radio. Owen recalled the story of the four of them riding together in a car through Laurel Canyon when their own record suddenly came over the radio. They turned it up and celebrated. It is easy, decades later, to forget how extraordinary that moment must have felt. Not long before, Cass had been singing harmony while serving tables. Now her voice was coming through radios across America. California Dreamin' was followed by more success, including Monday Monday, television appearances on programs such as The Ed Sullivan Show, and a Grammy for the group's performance of Monday Monday in 1967. The woman who had once struggled simply to earn a place beside the others had become part of one of the most recognizable sounds of the decade. Yet success did not erase the old wounds. Cass had finally been given a place on the stage. What she had not yet found was the acceptance she had been searching for off it. By the time America fell in love with the Mamas and the Papas, Cass Elliot no longer had to wonder whether audiences wanted to hear her voice. The records answered that question. So did the television appearances, the packed performances, and the Grammy-winning success of Monday Monday. Yet fame could solve only one kind of rejection. Inside the group, some of the things that had hurt Cass before success did not simply disappear when the hits began arriving. Her weight remained an easy subject for jokes, and eventually one of those jokes was preserved in the group's own music. In Creaky Alley, a song that playfully told part of the story of how the band came together, listeners heard the line, "No one's getting fat except Mama Cass." The nickname became inseparable from her public identity. To millions of fans, she was Mama Cass, a name spoken with affection, but it also reduced a complicated woman to an image she would later try to leave behind. There was another wound, however, that had little to do with what strangers thought of her. Cass had carried feelings for Denny Doherty since before the group became famous. She had followed him and the others to the Virgin Islands, sung beside him, and then shared the extraordinary rise that transformed four struggling musicians into stars. But while Cass hoped for something more, Denny's attention had turned towards someone much closer to her, Michelle Phillips. The problem was not simply that Michelle was Cass's friend and fellow singer. Michelle was married to John Phillips. Denny and Michelle began an affair, creating a secret inside a group already bound together by work, friendship, ambition, and increasingly complicated emotions. When Denny finally told Cass what had happened, the news devastated her. According to the account repeated in the first source, Cass confronted Michelle with a question that revealed just how deeply the situation had hurt. "You can have any man in the world. Why take the one man I love?" It was not the reaction of a distant colleague. This was a woman watching the person she wanted choose someone who stood beside her night after night. And still, the four of them had songs to record, appearances to make, and harmonies to sing. Years later, Denny recalled another moment that showed how long Cass held on to the possibility that things might change. One night, she proposed marriage to him. He later said he was so intoxicated that he never gave her an answer. Whatever hope Cass attached to that moment, it did not lead where she wanted. Yet this period is difficult to reduce to heroes and villains. These were young people living through sudden fame, while their friendships, marriages, attractions, and careers became tangled together. Cass and Michelle, despite everything, also shared a friendship that would remain significant long after the band itself was gone. What is clear is that the public cast and the private cast were living very different experiences. On television, she could appear joyful, funny, confident, and completely at home in the spotlight. Her voice could fill a room with an ease that made everything seem effortless. Away from the applause, she was still confronting some of the same questions that had followed her before fame. Whether she was wanted, whether she was enough, and whether the affection she gave would ever be returned in the way she hoped. America had chosen Cass Elliot. Record buyers had chosen her. Audiences had chosen her. But the man she wanted had not. And before long, she would begin looking for a different kind of love, one she hoped would never walk away. By the time Cass Elliot became a mother, she had already learned how uncertain love could be. Friendships changed, marriages ended, bands broke apart, and the man she had wanted most had chosen someone else. Then in 1967, a little girl entered her life. And according to that daughter many years later, motherhood represented something deeply personal to Cass. Owen Elliot would say that her mother had deliberately wanted a child because she wanted someone in her life who would love her and never leave. Whether Cass herself would have described the decision in exactly those words can no longer be known, but Owen grew up believing that she had been very much wanted. Cass called her daughter her very own, a phrase that carried such meaning that Owen connected it with her own name. Cass even established a music publishing company called Very Owen Music. In a life increasingly lived in front of cameras and audiences, this was a relationship she protected fiercely. Yet from the beginning, one question followed mother and daughter. Who was Owen's father? Cass refused to provide the answer publicly. According to Owen, her mother guarded his identity so closely that even people within their intimate circle did not know. There was no husband standing beside Cass when Owen was born, and the absence naturally encouraged speculation. But Cass apparently saw little reason to satisfy anyone's curiosity. The child was hers. That seemed to be what mattered. While this private mystery remained sealed, Cass's professional life was changing just as dramatically. The mamas and the papas had achieved an extraordinary amount in only a few years, but the relationships inside the group had become increasingly difficult, and Cass had begun to discover what her voice might sound like without the other three around it. Dream a Little Dream of Me became an important turning point. The song allowed listeners to hear her not simply as one quarter of a famous harmony group, but as a singer who could hold an audience on her own. Owen later believed that its success gave her mother a taste of what being a solo artist could feel like. Soon, Cass was ready to move forward, but there was another identity she increasingly wanted to move beyond. America knew her as Mama Cass, yet Cass herself wanted to be recognized as Cass Elliot. The nickname that had helped make her instantly recognizable had also become a box around her, connecting her again and again to the same public image she had spent years trying to outgrow. Her later television work would make that desire unmistakable with a title that said it plainly, "Don't Call Me Mama Anymore." There was an irony in those words. Publicly, she wanted to leave Mama behind. Privately, being Owen's mother may have been one of the roles she valued most. She could travel, record, appear on television, and pursue a career under her own name, but she remained intensely protective of the little girl waiting at home, and still she kept the identity of Owen's father to herself. Shortly before leaving for her final engagement in London years later, Cass visited Michelle Phillips while Owen and Chinna Phillips played nearby. Michelle asked the question that had lingered for years. Who is Owen's father? Cass did not answer. Instead, she promised to tell Michelle when she returned from London. That return would never happen. The secret would survive Cass herself, waiting more than a decade before the people she left behind finally began to uncover it. But before that mystery could be solved, Cass Elliot had another challenge ahead of her. She had finally stepped away from the group that once hesitated to accept her. Now she had to discover whether America would accept her standing entirely alone. Leaving the mamas and the papas gave Cass Elliot something she had wanted for years, The chance to stand before an audience without having to prove that she belonged beside anyone else. The success of Dream a Little Dream of Me suggested that listeners were willing to follow her beyond the group, and soon an opportunity arrived that could establish her as a major solo performer. Cass was booked for a 3-week engagement at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, a 6-figure deal that placed enormous expectations on her first major appearance alone. But with that opportunity came a familiar pressure. Cass believed she needed to lose weight, and this time she pushed her body extraordinarily hard. According to the account in Factinet, she followed a crash diet for 7 months, fasting 4 days each week and losing roughly 1/3 of her weight from around 300 pounds. On the outside, the transformation may have appeared to bring her closer to the image expected of a female entertainer at the time. Inside, however, her health was deteriorating. In the weeks before Las Vegas, Cass developed acute tonsillitis, hemorrhaging vocal cords, mononucleosis, and hepatitis. She was approaching one of the most important performances of her career with the very instrument on which that career depended, her voice, in serious trouble. And the room waiting for her only increased the pressure. Sammy Davis Jr., Jimi Hendrix, Mia Farrow, and other well-known figures were reportedly among those who came to see her debut. Cass had barely been able to rehearse. When she finally walked onto the stage, she struggled through the performance, weakened by illness and unable to produce the voice the audience expected. Her contract called for 2 shows that night. She returned for the second, hoping perhaps that things would improve, but they did not. Members of the audience began walking out. Caesar's Palace canceled the engagement, and the press response that followed was severe. Newsweek compared the disastrous debut to the sinking of the Titanic. For a performer who had spent years fighting to be taken seriously, the humiliation was difficult to escape. Cass fell into a deep depression, according to the first source, but the Las Vegas disaster did not end her career. She returned to television and continued appearing before American audiences, eventually hosting variety specials of her own. One of those titles, Don't Call Me Mom Anymore, said something important about where she wanted her career to go. She was trying to separate Cass Elliot from the nickname and image that had followed her since the Mamas and the Papas. She wanted to be seen as an entertainer in her own right. There were personal attempts at a new beginning as well. In 1971, she married journalist Donald von Wiedemann, but the marriage lasted only about 2 months. Through all of this, the struggle with dieting continued. By 1974, her body appeared to be sending warnings that were becoming harder to dismiss. While waiting backstage for an appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, Cass suddenly collapsed. Medical staff took her to the hospital. Later, she explained the incident as a drop in blood sugar or exhaustion and insisted that everything was fine. She kept working, and then came London. At the Palladium, the woman once forced to fight for a place in a group was now being presented as Cass Elliot, a solo performer, with 2 weeks of shows that Owen later described as sold out. It should have felt like vindication. In many ways, perhaps it did. But Cass had reached that moment after years of extreme dieting, relentless work, and repeated physical strain. The applause was finally hers alone. So were the warning signs. And when the London engagement ended, instead of stopping to rest, Cass stepped into a final stretch of celebrations that would lead toward a night no one around her understood was going to be her last. Before Cass Elliot left America for London in the summer of 1974, there was one goodbye that no one in her family understood would be final. Her daughter Owen was 7 years old and was going to Baltimore to spend the summer with her grandmother, while Cass traveled to England for her engagement at the London Palladium. Years later, Owen could still remember the smallest details of that day. Her mother took her through the airport, brought her onto the airplane, helped settle her into her seat, fastened her little seatbelt, and covered her with kisses. Cass told her not to worry. They would be together again soon. Before leaving the plane, she gave Owen one more instruction. Look toward the windows of the airport after I get off, because I'll be standing there waving to you. Owen looked. There was her mother behind the glass, waving goodbye. For the little girl, it was simply another separation in a life in which her mother often traveled for work. Only later would she understand that she had just watched Cass wave to her for the last time. In London, however, there was little reason to believe the end was so close. Cass had reached an important moment in the solo career she had fought to build. Owen later recalled that her mother had 2 weeks of sold-out performances at the Palladium, and she was being presented as Cass Elliot rather than merely as one member of the Mamas and the Papas. Yet the physical warning signs that had appeared before the trip had not disappeared. Earlier that year, Cass had collapsed while waiting backstage for an appearance with Johnny Carson and had been taken to the hospital. She later dismissed the episode as a problem with her blood sugar or simple exhaustion. After completing the Palladium engagement, she did not immediately retreat from public life to rest. According to the first account, she attended Mick Jagger's 31st birthday celebration in Chelsea, followed by a brunch held in her honor by actress Georgia Brown. People there noticed that Cass appeared unwell. She was coughing, frequently blowing her nose, and seemed to be having difficulty breathing. Still, the celebrations continued. Later, she attended another gathering hosted by entertainment journalist Jack Martin. Cass was normally remembered as someone who brought enormous energy into a room, but that evening, her appearance caused concern. Those around her reportedly thought she looked ill, even though she remained in good spirits. Once again, exhaustion seemed to offer the simplest explanation. Eventually, Cass decided to go home. She returned to an apartment in Mayfair belonging to her friend, singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson, and went to bed. It would be her final public night. When she failed to emerge from the bedroom the following day, concern grew. Her secretary entered the room and found her lifeless in bed. Cass Elliot was only 32. Across the Atlantic, Owen was still in Baltimore. She was at summer camp when she was brought home early. Her grandmother sat her down at the dining room table and told her that her mother had died and would not be coming home. Owen later remembered that she did not truly believe what she was hearing. Her mother traveled constantly. Being away was normal. To a 7-year-old child, perhaps the adults had simply made some terrible mistake. Owen got up from the table and walked away, holding on to the private certainty that somehow they did not understand. Her mother was coming back. Only when she returned to Los Angeles and faced the funeral did the truth begin to settle in. There were cameras, grieving friends, and a world suddenly speaking about Cass Elliot in the past tense. But even before her daughter could fully understand what had been lost, another story was beginning to spread. A story about what supposedly happened inside that London bedroom. It would become one of the most repeated tales about Cass Elliot's death. And according to Owen, it was never true. Within hours of Cass Elliot's death, the facts began competing with a story that would follow her for decades. A ham sandwich had been found near her bed, and soon the claim spread that the 32-year-old singer had choked while eating it. But according to Owen, the sandwich had not even been bitten. Her mother had died in her sleep after suffering a heart attack. Owen later explained that Cass's manager, Alan Carr, feared people might assume drugs were responsible, particularly after the highly publicized deaths of other young musicians of that era. According to Owen's account, Carr contacted journalist Sue Cameron and helped put the sandwich story into circulation. Whatever its original purpose, the rumor became remarkably difficult to erase. Owen remembered visiting friends as a child and having adults ask whether her mother had really died choking on a ham sandwich. For a 7-year-old already trying to understand why her mother had disappeared, the question left a lasting wound. Yet death had left another unanswered question behind. Cass had never publicly identified Owen's father. In 1986, while Michelle Phillips, John Phillips, and Denny Doherty were together during work on a documentary, Michelle mentioned that they had never known who Owen's father was. The reactions of John and Denny suggested otherwise. Once Michelle obtained the name, she began searching and eventually found him. Owen identified her biological father as musician Chuck Day. Michelle then handed Owen a plane ticket to San Francisco and encouraged her to meet him. Owen later learned something even stranger. Her father had attended Cass's funeral without identifying himself, standing across the street while the woman who had guarded his identity was laid to rest. But perhaps the most intimate discovery came without any search at all. Years after her mother died, Owen was looking through a photo album when a letter fell out. Cass had written it from London, but never mailed it. She addressed her daughter by her nickname, Owensky, and described ordinary things: the theater, its beautiful curtains, where she went, and what she did each day. There was no final message because Cass apparently did not know she was writing one. In October 2022, nearly half a century after her death, Cass Elliot received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But for those who grew up hearing California Dreamin' or Dream a Little Dream of Me, her voice had never really disappeared. Millions remembered Mama Cass. Owen remembered something more private: a mother fastening her seatbelt, promising they would see each other soon, then standing behind an airport window and waving goodbye. And perhaps that is where Cass Elliot's story feels most complete. To the world, she became an unforgettable voice. To one little girl waiting for her mother to come home, she was simply mom,